It's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's podcast, I featured Trudy and Dennis with the story of their mother in intensive care, where they dealt with a very difficult intensive care team. You can check out last week's podcast and Trudy's and Dennis' story by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to talk about the 5 compelling reasons why you need to have peace of mind, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Whenever you are faced with the challenge and the once-in-a-lifetime situation of having a loved one critically ill in intensive care, I know firsthand from more than 15 years intensive care nursing experience in 3 different countries, where I have literally worked with thousands of critically ill patients and their families, that most families of critically ill patients in intensive care have no peace of mind, they have no control, no power and no influence. Their emotional pain is palpable, it's real, and I know from just looking at their poor body language what's going on inside of them. Those families are bursting with tension, friction, and the massive upheaval in their life, and because they are having a loved one critically ill in intensive care, it's just too much for them to fathom. And even worse, families of critically ill patients in intensive care are so paralyzed by fear, they are so paralyzed by inaction, and what's inexcusable really is that they don't want to rock the boat when dealing with the intensive care team because they are scared of repercussions. It's the biggest mistake of critically ill patients in intensive care can ever make, to not rock the boat because they are afraid of repercussions from the intensive care team. Some statements from families of critically ill patients that I have heard over and over again include such as, "Let them do their work and don't interrupt," or "Just be quiet, don't ask too many questions because otherwise we might be in trouble." It frustrates and angers me when I hear these statements, and it just goes to show that even in this day and age, and even in the 21st century, families of critically ill patients in intensive care are intimidated by the perceived power and the perceived authority by the intensive care team. Those families of critically ill patients in intensive care, as a result, have no peace of mind, no control, no power and no influence. Therefore, today I want to give you the 5 compelling reasons why you need to have peace of mind, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Let's look at them. Number 1. Peace of mind, control, power and influence is so important during this once-in-a-lifetime challenge that you can't ignore it. If you are like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, you don't question, you don't do your own research, you don't stand up for your beliefs and your values, only to find that the intensive care team will be walking all over you and your critically ill loved one doesn't inform you and basically is keeping you at arm's length. The result is no peace of mind, no control, no power and no influence. The result is also that the intensive care team can drive home their mainly hidden agenda. They can use their perceived power and their perceived authority to their advantage, and they can use what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care to their advantage. Now, if you are watching this video right now, chances are that your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or is threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or is in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or worst of all, is even approaching their end of life in intensive care. And if you have found that you, your family, and your critically ill loved one are in one of those difficult, challenging, and heartbreaking situations, then I can only strongly recommend that you throw out all of your preconceived notions, your preconceived ideas, and your preconceived perceptions about intensive care, and do something very different compared to the 99% of families in intensive care who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. This leads me straight into the second compelling reason why you need to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. So, number 2, you, your family, and your critically ill loved one don't want to be dependent on what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. Because if you don't understand what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care, chances are that you'll wind up having no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. The intensive care team, generally speaking, finds it very easy to deal with families of critically ill patients in intensive care because of their perceived power and perceived authority status. That also means that it's easy for the intensive care team to drive home their mainly hidden agenda that's driven by the financial interests of the intensive care unit. Will they make money or will they lose money when treating your critically ill loved one? Also, the bed management pressures and the bed management interests of the intensive care team. For example, does the intensive care team currently experience a high pressure on their scarce, expensive, and precious intensive care beds? And do they therefore wish not to continue treatment because of other patients competing for their scarce, precious, and expensive intensive care beds? Or does the intensive care team want to unnecessarily continue treatment to keep their beds occupied, only to unnecessarily prolong the treatment and increase the suffering of your critically ill loved one in a real end-of-life situation to keep their beds occupied and make money? Also, the medical research interests of the intensive care team. For example, is your critically ill loved one enrolled in a medical research study that you or your critically ill loved one are unaware of and you haven't even given written or verbal consent for? Did you know that medical research in intensive care is a multi-billion-dollar per year industry, and that often the positioning of your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis by the intensive care team is dependent on the intensive care team's medical research interests? Let's look at number 3. If you don't have peace of mind, control, power, and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, chances are that the intensive care team is twisting and turning the clinical facts to their liking in order to keep you at arm's length and in order to drive home their mainly hidden agenda. Now, if you continue to do what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care do, you'll wind up having no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. If you also don't understand that the intensive care team's positioning, if you don't understand that the politics, the dynamics, the competing interests, the power play, the medical research interests, the intrigue, the psychology, and the hidden agenda of the intensive care team are the main drivers of what you get told about your critically ill loved one's situation, about your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis, that's when you are doomed. You need to get a very quick handle on things. You need to start doing your own research, and you need to start doing what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are not doing. You need to start asking questions. You need to start becoming difficult and demanding, and you need to start not taking no for an answer. Let's look at number 4. You and your family need to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence because you don't want to be dependent on the intensive care team's quote-unquote mercy or goodwill if your critically ill loved one's in a really difficult situation. I know I'm repeating myself here a little. However, I can't stress enough how important this is, because if your critically ill loved one is in a situation where they are either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or if they are in a life-threatening situation, or if they are in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or if they're having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or if they are threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or if they are in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or if they're even approaching their end of life in intensive care. You and your family don't want to be dependent on the intensive care team's mercy, grace, or goodwill. I have seen far too many situations in intensive care where the intensive care team has been using their shrewdness and adeptness to quote-unquote sell a withdrawal of treatment or a withdrawal of life support as being quote-unquote in the best interest of a critically ill patient, where clearly the things that were happening behind the scenes, such as the financial interests, the bed management pressures, the medical research interests, and all the politics and other competing interests were the main drivers for the intensive care team's positioning. If you are oblivious to these driving forces behind the scenes that 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are unaware of, you will also wind up like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care with no peace of mind, no power, no control, and no influence. Let's look at number 5. Peace of mind, control, power, and influence if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care don't come from following the herd. It's usually counterintuitive, and it comes from doing what other people are not prepared to do. Listen, if you continue to do what the 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are doing, who suck up to the intensive care team, who buy into the perceived power and the perceived authority of the intensive care team, you will wind up just like those families of critically ill patients in intensive care, and you'll end up with no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. You need to do something distinctly different, and you need to start doing your own research so that the intensive care team realizes that they are dealing with a powerful family, and so that they know that they can't force their hidden agenda onto you, onto your family, and onto your critically ill loved one. You need to go against the grain. You almost have to look at what everybody else is doing and do the complete opposite in order to get peace of mind, control, power, and influence. Don't do what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are doing who have no peace of mind, no power, no control, and no influence. And do what gets you results, what gets you peace of mind, control, power, and influence. How can you do that? And how can you quickly get peace of mind, control, power, and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power, and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power, and real control, and how you can influence decision-making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, discover the many competing interests in intensive care, and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle, and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power, and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care. And it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section, where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.